Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. So today is the beginning of the 20th of May of 2025, and since the beginning of the special military operation, the 20th of May of any year has become probably the worst day in every year since the beginning of the special military operation. For example, on the 20th of May of 2022, the Russians announced complete collapse and control over the city by the name of Mariupol. So the city was taken by the Russians by the 20th of May of 2022. For example, when talking about the 2023, on the 20th of May of that year, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the city by the name of Bakhmut. So another bad piece of news for the Ukrainians. When talking about the 2024, the Ukrainians during the 20th of May of 2024 lost its freedom and its democracy. We will discuss this in a minute. And during the period of time between the 19th and the 20th of May of 2025, the President of the Russian Federation and the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, probably found a solution how to deal with Ukraine, but basically, and according to different political experts, how to split Ukraine into different areas of influence. So let's start from the beginning. Now, when talking about 2022 and 2023, I believe everything is clear regarding Mariupol and Bakhmut. Now let's talk about 2024. Ukrainians on the 20th of May of 2024 lost its democracy and its freedom. So let's discuss this in details, and to understand what happened, we need to read this article and this small post. Exactly 6 years ago, on the 20th of May of 2019, Zelenskyy inauguration took place. Here's what he promised in his speech. So once again, since 20th of May of 2019, already 6 years passed, and all these 6 years, Zelenskyy was the president of Ukraine. Zelenskyy promised 6 years ago that he would do everything so that Ukrainians at least stop crying. Our very first task is a ceasefire in Donbass. We didn't start this war, but we must end this war, and we are ready for dialogue. I am ready to lose my popularity, my ratings, and if necessary, I am ready to lose my position without hesitation, just so peace can come. To everyone who is ready to build a new, strong, and successful Ukraine, I will gladly grant Ukrainian citizenship. So these statements were made by Zelenskyy 6 years ago, and I reminded, according to Ukrainian constitution, Zelenskyy, his legal power as a president ended on the 20th of May of 2024, exactly a year ago. So it's already 1 year when Zelenskyy prolonged his own terms with martial law. So this is the situation. And when talking about the 19th and then 20th of May, as we discussed, the President Trump and President of Russia, Putin, had a very important call, and that was probably something like a thunder, something like a shock for the Western countries and Ukraine itself. Zelenskyy, after Donald Trump, after this conversation, made several statements. Just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because the key they know details of negotiation and nobody else would be aware of it. So as you can see, after this conversation, Donald Trump reported that United States of America quit this negotiation process. Now Ukraine and Russia are going to be just two face-to-face to resolve all issues between them. Furthermore, Donald Trump made several more statements after this call. If there is no significant progress in Ukraine, the US will cede its role in the settlements to Europe, but we believe that this is already what is happening right now. There is a red line after which America will leave the negotiation process. We believe that these are talks about complete leave of the process. The Russians made several important statements as well about the situation. But, for example, the special aide of Putin, Ushakov, stated that the conversation was quite long, lasting 2 hours and 5 minutes. At the beginning of the conversation, Putin congratulated Trump on the birth of his 11th grandson, wishing health to the newborn and the US leader's daughter. The conversation was frank and constructive and took place in mutually respectful manner. The most important thing is that, according to information we have, the leaders do not rule out holding a personal meeting. The place and dates have not yet been determined. There was no talk in the conversation information about the time frame for reaching a possible agreement on a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, which means that the Russians most likely will continue their summer offensive operation. And as we discussed in the previous videos, the major battle will take place, and this major battle is going to take place between the city of Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Slaviansk, and Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. So let's discuss now the situation on the ground. And first, let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians are getting closer and closer to the settlement by the name of Odradne. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions once again. They managed to get the village from the south and from the east. The Russians are regrouping right now, and the Russians are trying to concentrate additional forces in this area. They are trying to concentrate a critical mass that can be used later for further offensive operation. As of now, the Ukrainians are trying to regroup themselves and to prepare their defense by bringing additional forces. But we see that the Russians establish complete active drone control over this territory, and everything that comes in this area is being destroyed by the Russians. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions along the river of Mokry Yali. So this information was published by several pro-Russian resources. We are waiting for additional details and additional videos. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. But according to information we have, the Russians finished the outflanking maneuver in the area of the village of Fedorovka. We expect at the beginning of battle for this settlement as well. So after the fall of Bogatyr, most likely the Russians will move their focus further in the direction of the village of Kamar. This is the next key village in this area, which will allow the Russians to establish complete control over the entire Donetsk region in this part of the region. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area of Russian breakthrough along the M32 road. Today we got additional icons, additional changes on the ground. First, let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 19th of May of 2025. Yesterday the Russians reported about complete control over the village of Novalenovka. Yesterday we got several geolocations from the settlement of Novopoltavka. And today we got additional changes on the ground that were published by different mappers. Today Natural Resources reported that indeed the Russians managed to improve their positions further in the northern direction from the village of Novopoltavka. The Russians managed to improve their positions and to get as close as possible to the next defense line, to the next defense belt between the villages of Poppy Yar, Poltavka, and the settlement by the name of Rusin Yar. But I'll remind you that yesterday, according to several pro-Russian resources, the armed force of the Russian Federation managed to get this line, but as for the beginning of the 20th of May of 2025, this line of combat contact hasn't been confirmed by the Russian, neither by the Russian resources nor by the pro-Ukrainian resources. So about this progress, we still have some doubts. At the same time, we start receiving first updates from the village of Poppy Yar. In this video, we can see how the Russians established complete control over the territory above this village with the drones. The Russians, as you can see, are attacking and destroying Ukraine vehicles, supplying machines, so which means that the Russians are planning to move further in this direction with the purpose to take this village under complete control, and the Russians are going to do this in the very near future. So due to the situation on the ground, we expect that the Russians are planning to attack the village in the very near future. Of course, there are at least 3 or 4 or 5 big strongholds in front of the Russians, but telling the truth, and due to how fast the Russians establish control over the village of Novopoltavka, we expect that the Ukrainians are not going to show huge resistance in this area, and all these strongholds would be taken by the Russians in the very near future. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue advancing on the western flank of the Kliban-Byksky pocket. We have several changes on the ground, as you can see. We have several icons. So let's discuss them in details, and first let's compare the map. For example, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 19th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 20th of May. The Russians improved their positions by taking under control additional tree lines and strongholds in this area. At the same time, the Russians are moving their FPV drone focus further in the north and the northeastern direction with the purpose to clear additional tree lines and additional roads that the Russians are going to attack in the very near future. So we see that the situation continues escalates, and the situation is continue getting worse and worse for Ukrainians. When talking about the most southern part of the Kliban-Byksky pocket, during the previous 24 hours, according to several pro-Russian resources, the Russians managed to improve their positions, but we believe that Ukrainians, due to high risk of being encircled by the Russian forces, decided to fall back from this area. So something like this, Ukrainians were forced to abandon during the previous 24-48 hours further in the northern direction with the purpose to stick as close as possible to the main evacuation road, so to have no problem problems when orders come to evacuate from this area without or with the minimal losses from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the city of Terezk. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue advancing, but during the previous 24 hours, several changes on the ground were discovered along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. This information at least was provided by pro-Russian and by neutral resources. So as you can see, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians took under control this dense network of the fortifications to the west of the village of Zaryanovka. This is a very important defense belt, and now we see that the Russians are going to move further, and most likely the Russians will face no resistance while moving along this tree line in the direction of the northern Delivka. So we expect that the battle for the northern Delivka is going to start in the very near future, and this is a key village in this area. If the Russians are able to take this village under complete control, this is going to mean the beginning of the battle for the southeastern part of Konstantinovka itself. Now let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar. During the previous 24 hours, we got report that the Russians managed to improve their positions along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal itself to the north of the city of Chasiv Yar. If you remember, we discussed in details that most likely during the next days or weeks, the Russians will try to maintain their positions along canal with the purpose to have possibilities to concentrate additional forces in this area, with the purpose then to use them while attacking the Konstantinovka agglomeration. So we start receiving first updates that the Russians began improving their positions here, but we see that at the same time the Russians haven't managed to finish the battle for the city of Chasiv Yar itself, which is obviously not something that goes according to Russia's plans. Now let's talk about the city of Siversk and the Siversk direction. After a short operational pause, the Russians resumed their attacks, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north of the village and in the direction on the territory of the village itself. For example, in this video we can see how Ukrainians were bombing Russians on their positions along the tree line that goes right exactly to the north of the village of Verkhnykamenskoye, which means that the Russians managed to secure this village completely. The next target is the next villages, next tree lines to the west, and most likely the Russians are going to attack this territory in the very near future. And if the Russians are able to take these tree lines under complete control, then the Russians most likely will turn in the southern direction, will try to attack Verkhnykamenskoye from the west. So we see that the battle for Verkhnykamenskoye is coming to an end. Furthermore, according to several neutral mappers, the Russians during the previous 12-24 hours managed to establish complete control over the central part and over the farms in the southern part of the settlement. The biggest and the most powerful stronghold of the village was taken by the Russians, and now the Russians are going to move obviously from this point further in the western direction with the purpose to take the village of Novovasilivka and to attack the village from the east. So if the village of Verkhnykamenskoye and Novovasilivka fall, then the Russians most likely will try to maintain their positions along this red line, including positions in the vicinity of Ivanodarivka, Vyimka and the railways. And this is also going to be the beginning of the battle for the city of Siversk. When talking about the Liman direction, during the previous 24 hours we had just one video how the Russians destroyed another temporary deployment point of the FPV drone operators in the area of Zarishna. So if we increase the numbers of updates from this direction, we're going to see that the Russians currently are trying to reduce to ruins the village of Zarishna. Lots of explosions, lots of attacks the Russians carry out, so the Russians are trying to prepare the village before the beginning of the ground operation. Most likely this ground operation is going to start very soon. When talking about the northern directions, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just very interesting details from the Sumy area. Several sources reported that the Russians managed to restore control over the border in the vicinity of Grafovka and Yapyakhovo. I'll remind you that these territories, according to several mappers, were taken by the Ukrainians during Ukrainian attempts to attack the territory of the Russian Federation. And based on those reports, we have colored this territory as a contested area, but today we got additional reports from pro-neutral and pro-Russian resources that the Russians restore control over this territory, so that is why we restore control over this territory as well. Once again, since the beginning of Ukrainian attempts to improve their positions in this part, we haven't received even a single video that Ukrainians managed to answer these territories. So that is why we have adjusted the territories back in Russian favor. Very interesting details are coming from the Sumy direction. Most likely the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Loknya. Today pro-Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see how Ukrainians were flying above Russian positions and where Ukrainians were attacking Russian units and Russian temporary deployment points in the area of Male Loknya. So as you can see, based on this video, we have adjusted the map. There are lots of episodes in this video and several of them were geolocated. So this is the first place where Ukrainians were attacking Russians, and this is the second place. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map, and now we see that the Russians finished the battle for Loknya. Most likely, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information in the very near future. And now we see that the Russians managed to answer and managed to approach to the village of Yunakivka from the north. So basically, today, the battle for the village of Yunakivka officially started. So now the Russians are going to improve their positions. The Russians are going to increase their pressure, because if the Russians can take under control the village of Yunakivka, this is going to be a very big media victory for the Russians. Furthermore, Russian control over the settlement of Yunakivka will force the Ukrainians to fall back from these villages, from these forests, with the purpose to maintain the lines and not be encircled by the Russians during continuous Russian offensive operation. When talking about the Tetkina direction, we have one video. This is the video, and here we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking this forest, which means that Ukrainians, during their attempts to answer the territory of the Russian Federation, managed to take this forest under complete control. So this is the video, and based on this video, we have adjusted this small part of the Russian Federation in Ukrainian favor. So, and that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds to we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.